Hello you absolute legends. In my previous video I talked about John Kalita, the 55-year-old speedrunner who introduced the strategy of looking down to run faster in Goldeneye speedrunning. But as it turns out, look down wasn't the only concept that John introduced to the Goldeneye speedrunning community. In fact, his second contribution was also massively impactful and involves a secret technique that every Goldeneye speedrunner uses today. Kalita called his technique the Illinois Cross of Death, but these days it is ubiquitously known simply as the dot. When first-person shooters were first popularized in the early 90s, with revolutionary games such as Wolfenstein 3D and Doom, aiming was simple. Weapons were centered, making it easy to line up shots. Looking around was only possible on the horizontal plane, so all you had to worry about was making sure your enemy was in front of your gun. It is for this reason that in these early shooters, programmers had not considered implementing an in-game crosshair. In 1994, games such as System Shock and CYCLONES attempted innovative aiming schemes that brought the vertical plane into the equation. Here, crosshairs were necessary to tell the player exactly where they were targeting. These games were explorative, but still primitive, and had not completely solved the problem of aiming freely and easily in a 3D space. The camera perspective and crosshair were navigated separately, which led to a somewhat slow and clunky control over accuracy. 1994's Marathon saw the next evolutionary step in first-person shooter controls. Here, we saw the implementation of free look, giving players the ability to look left, right, up, and down with the mouse. By 1996, these controls had been perfected and were showcased in the masterpiece QUAKE. Looking around became seamless in a fully three-dimensional environment. Both QUAKE and Marathon still had centered weapons, and thus aiming using the gun's sight was still the default setting, though QUAKE did include the option to display a basic crosshair as well. Centered weapons would not remain common in first-person shooters. Both Marathon and Rise of the Triad introduced the concept of dual wielding, and by necessity, the concept of guns positioned either side of center. But it wasn't until 1995's Star Wars Dark Forces that we saw the first side-mounted single weapon, attempting to accurately depict the holding of a gun in one's hand. Of course, moving the weapon to the side removes our ability to use it to aim our shots, so a crosshair starts to become crucial, especially when precise shooting is necessary. The massively successful Duke Nukem 3D, released in 1996, further popularized off-centered weapons and did include a crosshair by default. But despite the growing need for some kind of overlay letting the player know where they were aiming, not every developer was quick to follow suit. In 1997, the Nintendo 64 released a string of first-person shooters. These included ports or reimaginings of PC games such as Doom and Hexen, as well as original concepts like TUROK Dinosaur Hunter. All of these games share one commonality: there was no crosshair. During GoldenEye 007's development, elements were borrowed heavily from the light gun arcade shooter VIRTUA Cop, as GoldenEye was originally intended to be an on-rails shooter. The features that drew inspiration from VIRTUA Cop included gun reloading and position-dependent hit reaction animations. The ability to score instant kills with headshots, as well as the requirement to destroy small targets to complete objectives, meant that precision was paramount. The developers did include the ability to toggle on a red sight to allow for more accurate shooting, but this feature completely immobilizes Bond, preventing him from moving. Obviously, the inability to aim while running is detrimental to speed, so using this function is out of the question for speedrunners. Many GoldenEye speedruns require incredibly precise shooting. To save time, targets are shot from as far away as possible, even targets that are so far away they aren't even visible. Without some way to aim while moving, completing objectives quickly becomes incredibly difficult. Perfect Dark, released in the year 2000, was the second best-selling first-person shooter for the Nintendo 64. By this time, the crosshair was universally included in first-person shooters, and Perfect Dark was no exception. In the years following its release, the Perfect Dark speedrunning scene was thriving, and completely dwarfed Goldeneye in popularity. But some Perfect Dark speedrunners would come across and start playing its predecessor. While the games share a lot of similarities, the switch from Perfect Dark to Goldeneye shed light on the shortcomings of the older game. Perfect Dark speedrunners who had become familiar with the use of its crosshair immediately noticed the inability to aim in Goldeneye with precision. People who had been playing Goldeneye for years didn't even know what they were missing, and certainly didn't realize this was an area that was ripe for optimization. Several Perfect Dark players did find a way to overcome this problem. Obviously, they couldn't use the crosshair available in the game, but they could achieve a similar effect by placing a physical marker on the center of their TV screen. Now, they could know exactly where they were aiming in Goldeneye, which made gameplay a hell of a lot easier. We don't know exactly when players began to use markers on their TVs, as anyone who was actually using the technique was doing so in secret. At best, it was because it didn't occur to them to let anyone else know, and at worst, because they were hoping to gain an unfair advantage over other players. The first public mention of using a makeshift crosshair was made on the 25th of July 2002 by the 55-year-old speedrunner John Kalita. This was 3 days after his very first post and several weeks before his look-down strategy was universally confirmed to be faster. He called his technique the Illinois Cross of Death. He described stripping down a matchstick to create a cross that he stuck to the center of the screen. Now that the cat was out of the bag, the Perfect Dark players started confessing that they had already been using the technique. All of the runners that had only played Goldeneye were completely ignorant to the use of a makeshift crosshair, while the Perfect Dark players who had moved over had been using them for months, or even years. There were a few different methods that players were using to mark their screens, but the most common technique was to mark a very small dot with either tape or a marker. Using a dot eventually would become the universal standard, as it covers up less of the screen, allows for slightly more precision, and is easier to create. Thus, it would continue to be referred to simply as the dot. In contrast to Kalita's other contribution of lookdown, the dot was met with universal praise. In fact, I personally implemented the dot immediately and was able to use it to set new records. Even as late as May of 2002, when I set new records on the Egyptian stage, you can see that I used the in-game crosshair to aim up a very difficult shot. This is not optimal, of course, but as I was completely unaware of the use of a dot, I didn't see any other way to execute the run. Just weeks after I learned of the dot, I used it to beat the record on Bunker 1's Secret Agent, which requires very quick and precise shots on small cameras, as well as the record on Train Agent, which relies on cutting the floor with a watch laser as quickly as possible. Both levels rely heavily on accuracy, so the new technique was extremely useful. For those who weren't already using a dot, it improved their game dramatically and raised their skill level instantly. Kalita may not have been the first to use a dot, but he definitely has to be credited with bringing it to the attention of the wider community. Nowadays, every Goldeneye speedrunner uses a dot, and it is one of the very first things that people will recommend to newer players. Of course, dots aren't unique to Goldeneye and have been used by thousands of players for many different games. These days, with the spread of knowledge on the internet, it's no longer the obscure technique it once was. Back in the very early days, it was actually very easy for entire communities to be kept in the dark about best practices. And while a few players here and there may have come up with the idea by themselves, it was much more difficult for something like this to spread until someone took the initiative and shared the idea. These days, makeshift crosshairs are pretty common, and some companies have now even tried to market sophisticated dots. Though honestly, they usually perform worse than the simpler designs. Nothing really beats a small blob of blue tack or a small dot with a marker. It's a simple idea, but the dot has had a tremendous impact on Goldeneye speedrunning, and when the hero John Colita made his influential post, it was a godsend. Who knows just how long those conniving Perfect Dark players would have kept their little secret, if not for that absolute legend.